was 12 years old the Christmas it happened, still young enough to believe that the mountains were simple things, old and quiet and harmless. My grandparents' farmhouse sat deep in the Appalachian hills, far enough that the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile through the trees, and the only real sounds at night were the wind and the creaking of the old barns settling into the cold. Every winter break, my parents dropped me off there while they worked through the holidays, and I never complained. Something about the solitude of that place felt alive in a way the city never did. But that year, it felt different as soon as the snow began falling. The storm had rolled in early on Christmas Eve, heavy and thick, turning the world white by noon. My grandmother kept commenting on how quiet everything was, how even the birds seemed to be hiding from the cold. The house felt insulated, tucked under a blanket of snow so deep you couldn't tell where the yard ended and the forest began. We spent the evening by the fire, drinking hot chocolate while my grandfather told the same stories he always did. About hunters getting lost in sudden fog, about strange lights seen across the valley, about old miners who wandered out of the hills long after everyone assumed they died underground. I'd heard all of them before. They'd never bothered me. But that night, even those familiar stories carried a strange weight. Maybe it was the weather, or the pressure of the storm settling on the roof, or maybe I was just getting old enough to realize stories sometimes came from real places. Whatever the reason, when my grandmother told me to sleep in the attic room to enjoy the view, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I didn't argue. I never did. But I remember pausing at the bottom of the attic stairs, staring up into the darkness, feeling like something upstairs was waiting for me. The attic room wasn't big, just a bed, a dresser, and that single window overlooking the tree line behind the house. My grandfather had told me once that the room used to belong to his older brother, who died before I was born. I'd never asked what happened. I didn't want to know. The window was what I always remembered most. How it framed the woods like a picture, especially in winter. That night it glowed with a faint blue light from the snow, making the trees look like dark hands reaching upward. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day, wrapped under so many quilts I could barely move. When I woke, it wasn't to a sound, there was no noise at all, but to a feeling. A pressure behind my eyes, like I'd been pulled awake by something that wanted me up. The room was freezing. Each breath rose in a small cloud, and through the fogged-over window, a soft orange glow shimmered between the trees. At first, I thought it was my grandfather. He always carried an old tin lantern when he checked on the animals at night, and sometimes if I was awake, I could see him pass by the barn or the fence line. But his lantern flickered. It had a distinct sway with his footsteps. This light didn't move like that. It drifted, smooth and slow, like it was floating through water. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, and pushed the blankets off my legs. The floor was so cold it hurt to put my feet on it, but curiosity was stronger than fear. I walked to the window and wiped a circle into the frost with the sleeve of my pajama shirt. The light glowed brighter now, a deep orange, like embers cradled in a glass jar. But there was no jar. No hand holding it. It hovered just above the snow, bobbing slightly as if aware of its own balance. I whispered, "Grandpa," even though I already knew it wasn't him. The light paused at the tree line, right at the boundary between forest and yard. Then, slowly, too slowly, it lifted upward until it leveled with my window. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The glow didn't brighten or flicker. It stared. That's the only way I can describe it. Even though it was just light, no shape or shadow behind it, the presence was unmistakable. Something was looking back at me. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over the edge of the rug. The floorboards under my feet vibrated with a low hum I could feel more than hear. It wasn't the house settling. It felt purposeful, like a trembling signal running through the woods straight into my bones. When I dared to look again, the light had moved closer. Much closer. It now floated just outside the window, inches from the glass. The brightness pulsed softly. Dim, bright, dim, like a heartbeat. The attic felt smaller, closing in around me. The air warmed, oddly and unnaturally, as though something was breathing against the window from the outside. My skin prickled with heat that didn't match the cold room. I wanted to scream for my grandparents, but my voice was gone. My throat felt locked. All I could do was back up until my shoulders pressed against the wall beside the bed. The light held there for several moments, pulsing, studying me. The vibrations in the floor spread up the walls, subtle but unmistakable, as if the whole house was resonating with the thing outside. Then, just as slowly as it had risen, the lantern drifted downward, disappearing beneath the window frame. I pressed forward, half terrified, half desperate to know where it went. But when I reached the glass and looked down, the yard was empty. Just smooth, untouched snow that reflected the pale moonlight like a frozen lake. No footprints. No shadows. Nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in the corner wrapped in every blanket I could find. The house felt different. Lighter, maybe, or hollowed out. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or if the thing had passed through the walls and lingered somewhere inside. The warm patch on the window faded slowly, long after it should have. When morning came, I finally crept downstairs. My grandparents were already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, eating breakfast like it was just another Christmas morning. I forced myself to look out the back window, searching for evidence, any sign that something had been there. The snow was still perfect. Smooth. Untouched. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want them to laugh, or worse, tell me a story I wasn't ready to hear. But while my grandmother cooked, my grandfather poured himself coffee and looked toward the attic stairs with a frown like he'd noticed something off. "You sleep okay up there?" he asked. I opened my mouth, ready to lie, but something in his expression stopped me. There was worry there. Not disbelief. Not amusement. Just worry. I told him about the light. How it floated, how it rose to the window, how it watched. He didn't interrupt. He didn't even blink. When I finished, he let out a long breath and stared out the kitchen window toward the tree line. "Snow like this brings things out," he murmured. "Old things. Things that ain't supposed to get this close to folks." I asked him what he meant, but he shook his head and stood up, placing a hand on my shoulder. His palm was trembling. "You saw it once," he said. "That's enough." For the rest of the day, he kept checking the windows, scanning the woods, lowering the curtains earlier than usual. He didn't say we were in danger, but he didn't have to. The tension in his shoulders said enough. The way he kept listening for something outside the house said even more. That night, I refused to sleep in the attic. My grandparents didn't argue. They didn't even ask why. My grandmother made a bed for me on the sofa downstairs, close to the fireplace and far from that window overlooking the woods. Even now, decades later, I still feel that warmth on the glass when I think about it. I still remember the way it pulsed, slow and steady, like a living heartbeat. And sometimes, when winter comes heavy and silent, I swear I see a faint orange glow between the trees, waiting, watching, remembering the boy who stared back. I was driving home from the lodge long after the last guest had finally stumbled back to their room, cheeks red from too much cocoa and holiday cheer. Christmas shifts always ran late, but the quiet after closing was almost peaceful. Just the soft hum of the heater as I cleaned up, the muffled sound of wind against the windows, the snow piling higher outside. By the time I got into my car, the entire mountain felt frozen in place. Not a single light showed through the trees as I turned onto the ridge road. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, the kind that makes you feel like you've stepped into a world that forgot you existed. The tires crunched through the ice and powder, and for the first few minutes, I didn't think much of the emptiness. Winter nights here were always desolate. The only unsettling thing was the way the snow reflected my headlights, making the forest glow faintly like something was breathing just beyond the trees. Every few seconds, the car slid slightly, and I had to steady the wheel. The guardrails were buried under drifts, leaving nothing between me and the long drop down the mountainside. I was halfway down the ridge when I first saw the figure. A tall shape standing in the middle of the road, barely visible through the swirling snow. I slowed down instinctively, heart thudding. Nobody walked this road at night. Not in this weather, not with how isolated it was. They were bundled in an oversized coat, head bowed, but their posture was wrong. Stiff. Too still for someone trying to stay warm in sub-zero wind. I rolled my window down, letting in a blade of icy air that cut straight through my jacket. "You need help," My voice sounded too loud in the emptiness. The figure didn't answer. They turned their heads slightly, not enough for me to see a face, and then stepped to the side, raising one arm and pointing further down the road. It wasn't a go-ahead gesture. It was almost urgent, as if urging me to move for my own sake. But when I pressed the gas pedal, nothing happened. The engine was running, the lights were bright, but the car didn't budge. It felt like something heavy was holding it in place. Not like the tires were stuck, like the frame itself was pinned down. I pressed harder, panicking, but the car stayed perfectly still. The figure slowly walked toward my open window, footsteps silent in the snow. Something in me screamed to roll the window up, to lock the doors, to do anything, but I was frozen, gripped by a fear I didn't understand. When they leaned in close enough for me to see their face, the breath left my lungs. There was nothing there. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, not even skin, just a hollow indentation where a face should have been. Snowflakes drifted through the emptiness, melting on the shape of a head that wasn't entirely solid. It reminded me of a shadow caught in midair, a place where light refused to land. I jerked back, hitting my shoulder against the steering wheel. The figure didn't react. It tilted its faceless head as if studying me, or listening. I didn't hear anything, not at first. But then, beneath the howl of the wind, beneath the hum of my engine, came footsteps. Soft at first, like someone walking slowly through deep snow. Then another pair. Then more. Many more. But they weren't coming from the figure standing beside me. They were behind my car. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Something primal in me screamed not to look. The footsteps grew louder, closer, pacing unevenly as if dozens of people were circling the car, surrounding it. The faceless figure stepped back, giving me a final, almost sympathetic tilt of the head. Their arm lifted again, this time pointing behind me. I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't want to see what would happen next. The footsteps pressed closer until they seemed to brush against the bumper, the trunk, the rear windows. My fingers dug into the steering wheel. My breath fogged the air. The cold felt like it was seeping into my bones. Then, without me touching anything, the car lurched forward violently, sliding several feet before gaining speed. My eyes snapped open, and the road blurred past as the vehicle shot downhill. I swerved wildly, trying to regain control as the taillights reflected once, just once, off a cluster of tall, unmoving shapes standing in the road behind me. I didn't stop until I reached my driveway 20 minutes later, shaking so hard I could barely pull the keys from the ignition. I sat there for a long time listening, but the only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant creak of ice cracking on the trees. The next morning, I told myself it must have been exhaustion, or the storm playing tricks on my eyes. That the footsteps were just falling snow. That the figure could have been a stranded hiker, even though the police said nobody reported a missing person. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been on that ridge road with me. Something that wanted me to stop. Something that didn't want to be seen. I stayed off that mountain road for the rest of the winter. Yet every Christmas Eve since, without fail, when the snow piles high and the wind turns sharp, I hear it again. Not loud, not close, just a faint rhythm somewhere behind me. 2 footsteps, then 4, then many, many more. Always on frozen ground, always pacing, always waiting for me to look back. I grew up in a town so small most people forgot it existed unless they needed a place to pass through on their way to somewhere better. But if there was one thing our little Appalachian hollow held onto, it was Christmas. Folks still walked from house to house with lanterns and scarves wrapped up to their eyes, singing so loud the sound bounced down the mountainside. My earliest memories were of opening the front door to a cluster of neighbors singing Silent Night, breath hanging in the cold like ghosts. By the time I was 17, it felt like the only tradition we had left. That winter should have been the same, but a storm rolled in hard 2 days before Christmas and took the whole county down with it. Power out. Roads iced over. No carolers. No anything. Just the thick kind of darkness you can't get in the city. The kind that presses against the windows and makes even familiar rooms feel a little spacious, a little alive. My mother lit candles everywhere she could find them, but the glow barely held the shadows back. I kept telling myself I was too old to be spooked by a blackout, but something about that night gnawed at me. The wind wasn't howling. It wasn't doing anything. The whole mountain was dead silent, like it was listening. We'd just finished cleaning up after a late dinner when it happened. 3 slow taps on the back door. That door was almost never used. It faced the woods and opened onto a narrow porch that sagged so badly my father had nailed wooden planks across it to keep animals from getting stuck underneath. Nobody came to that door. Ever. My mother froze halfway to the sink, holding a dish towel like she'd forgotten what she was doing. "Don't answer that," she whispered, though I don't think she even meant to say it out loud. I tried to laugh it off. "It's probably just the bakers. Their heat might have gone out again." I grabbed one of the candles and walked toward the back of the house, careful not to breathe too hard. The flame was small, fragile. The hallway seemed longer than usual. Each step felt like I was walking into something thick and waiting. When I reached the door, I raised the candle and peered through the frosted glass. At first, all I could see was my own reflection warped by the ice. Then the shape appeared, a person standing just inches away on the other side. Tall. Still. Wearing what looked like an old-fashioned coat and a long wool scarf that hung stiffly down their chest. Their head was tilted, almost curious. Before I could speak, a low whisper slid through the crack under the door. "Can I sing for you?" It wasn't a question. The voice didn't sound like it belonged to someone asking permission. It was too soft, too thin, like the words had been stretched out before reaching my ears. The sound made my stomach twist, and I stepped back without meaning to. "Who is it?" My mother hissed from the kitchen. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because as soon as the voice faded, the humming began. It wasn't a Christmas song, not even close. The melody came in uneven waves, rising and falling like whoever was humming didn't understand music but was trying to imitate it anyway. The notes felt wrong, like they didn't belong to any scale I knew. The candle flame quivered, shrinking low. For a moment, I thought the humming was coming from outside. But the longer it went on, the more it sounded like it was threading through the walls themselves, sliding between the beams and settling into the wood. My mother hurried toward me, blowing out candles as she passed. "Get away from the door," she whispered urgently. "Blow that out. Now." I obeyed without thinking. The darkness swallowed the flame in an instant, reducing everything to a soft slice of moonlight through the window. The humming didn't stop. If anything, it grew clearer, closer. The figure on the porch never moved. Not an inch. Their silhouette stayed perfectly still, like it had been carved out of the night air. No shiver, no shifting weight, no visible breath. The scarf didn't even sway in the draft threading through the old frame of the door. Then the humming shifted. It softened, warping into slow, broken words, syllables that didn't match any language I knew. My mother pressed her hands against the door as if trying to hold something back, and I could feel her tremble. She wasn't the kind of woman who scared easily. Seeing her like that made something cold run down my spine. "Go to your room," she whispered. I shook my head. I didn't want to leave her alone with whatever was out there. But she raised her voice, just enough to cut through the humming. "Now." I backed away, eyes fixed on the outline through the glass. For a split second, I swear the figure tilted their head toward me, as if hearing my retreat. The humming dipped lower, stretching into a sound I can only describe as breath wrapped in melody. I turned and walked down the hall, forcing myself not to run. I sat at the top of the stairs, listening. My mother stayed at the door. I could hear her whispering something, maybe a prayer or maybe just trying to steady herself. The humming went on and on. Time blurred. I don't know how long it lasted, minutes, maybe an hour. But eventually, without warning, it stopped. The house felt instantly colder, like something had lifted away. When my mother finally came into the hallway, her face was pale and she wouldn't look at the door. We stayed awake until the lights flickered back on sometime near dawn. Only then did she let me follow her to the back porch. The storm had ended. The snow had hardened into a smooth, untouched sheet. We looked for footprints, any sign that someone had stood there in the night. There was nothing. Not a trace. Even the thin frost that gathered on the glass during the night hadn't been disturbed. My mother didn't talk about it for years. Whenever I brought it up, she'd shake her head and say, "Some things don't need repeating." I think she believed acknowledging it would draw it back. But the thing is, silence doesn't help. Forgetting doesn't help. Because every so often, especially on quiet winter nights when the power flickers and the wind settles, I hear it again. A slow, thin humming drifting through the back door. A melody that never belonged to Christmas. A voice that never belonged to any person in town. It's never loud, never threatening. Just present. Waiting. And every time, I freeze the exact same way my mother did, because deep down I know, whatever stood at our back door that night wasn't looking for a song to share. It was looking for someone to listen.